but just so we don't delay this longer, I've sent my presentation a few moments ago. I just want to confirm from the team in 𝙈𝘼 that they received it and maybe they can display it. I'm still not getting permission to share my screen for some reason. I apologize. These things happen. But the team there should have it now if they can share it from their end, from the email that Mustafa sent me. We should be able to proceed. But I think this delay has given us a chance for some discussion, because when I was texting the team in 𝙈𝘼 earlier this morning and asked them, when do you plan a Q&A? And they said there is no Q&A. So it's a good opportunity that we have a moment to discuss. It's great to see you, Tom. Thank you for taking the time to come in and make this welcome and introduction. I think it's been exactly a year since you and I met in person last in Paris at our offices at the UIA offices. Yep. So it's almost been exactly a year since we've met, and it's always wonderful to see you. And I'm very grateful for this invitation and grateful for Tom's suggestion that I join the conversation around the post-pandemic shift and the changes that we've made. So I'll be speaking from the perspective of our work at the UIA as the co-director of the Education Commission. I work closely with my colleague 𝙈𝙊𝙎𝙏𝘼 and a group of members that represent broadly all UIA's 5 regions. We work closely with Tom, our president, and the team at the UIA, and we've been very much concerned and involved in conversation around what the future will bring around this post after the pandemic, and what will shift and what will change and what will hopefully go back to more normal. We can have the next slide. Thank you. So a very interesting thing happened almost exactly a year ago in architectural education. We were pushed into a global social experiment of a scale that would have been impossible for any researcher to really create in reality. We have all been under the same circumstances almost instantaneously overnight. And it really has forced a very accelerated incubation of ideas around architectural education and teaching that we have long been discussing. So for almost a decade now, and UIA was actually in the midst of having a digital conversation at that meeting at the end of January 2020 that I was just referring to in my discussion with Tom. We were discussing the role that the digital could play moving forward into roles like validation and accreditation globally, reduction of costs, reduction of carbon footprint, and so on and so forth. So it's something as educators we have been aware of and talking about. We've dreamed of working in paperless studios. We've dreamed of multiple hyper collaborative spaces where we could have individuals from all over the globe come in and co-teach our studios with us. And all of this was theoretical, and there were a few spots of actual practice where it was happening. But overnight, we were thrust into the necessity to actually make these research ideas or these hypotheticals a reality. So there was an accelerated incubation period, and we very quickly moved from the traditional studio model to, if we can move to the next slide, please, to our reality, which is this online impersonal matrix of squares on a page or squares on a screen. And the screen has become this barrier between us and our students. And very quickly at the UIA and across the global architectural education landscape, if we can move to the next slide. Can we move to the next slide, please? We very quickly revolved around a few key questions that we were already trying to think hopefully and optimistically beyond the pandemic, in addition, of course, to scrambling to figure out solutions whilst we were in the midst of the pandemic. We very quickly shifted our thinking to what would happen next. And what are the gains of this type of online, purely virtual, purely digital architectural education experiences? What are the things that we've lost? What will the new normal be? And most importantly, what are the lessons that we can learn and take forward from this crisis? And as the saying goes, never let a good crisis go to waste. We would be remiss not to take a moment to reflect on the possible benefits, the possible strategies and tools that could be effective moving forward, make architectural education perhaps more accessible, more powerful, more resilient, more flexible, more adaptable. There are many benefits, I think, if we are smart and work together and share experiences broadly, that we can make architectural education better moving out of this crisis. Next slide, please. So there were a number of gains and losses that we very quickly across the architectural education community began to identify. Some of the pros or gains that we have is some time efficiency. Commute times were cut down tremendously, travel in general. I think I've spoken in more countries in the past 12 months than I have ever before, although my travel schedule is typically very busy. Tom's is even more so. But I know I've been in multiple meetings with Thomas in different countries all over the world in the span of a few hours. So time efficiency and agility to engage in different contexts in a very efficient way is one of the gains that we found. The ability to connect across borders. Many of us in architectural education have done things that we could have always done, but this pandemic has forced us now to do. We've brought in guest speakers. We've been able to convene conversations like this that cross borders, that bring in expertise and exchange knowledge in a way that is much more flexible. There have been some fundamental sustainability gains. Reduced energy consumption, both on the operation of our learning spaces, but also the reduction of commuting times. A lot of those gains, however, have been shifted into the costs that individuals have to bear in setting up their own technological infrastructures. And this is a problem, particularly in more poverty-stricken parts of the world. Again, sustainability gains, reduced material consumption and printing. All architecture schools now have more money in the black in their printing costs because we are no longer creating these huge, massive panels of students' work, and we're doing everything paperless and digital, which is an idea we've always had for sustainability reasons, and that we're now doing in reality and finding that is much more doable than we thought. And because of these cross-border conversations and how easy and popular and common they have become, we've really engaged in much more rigorous pan-regional social cultural dialogue. And just recently, if I can digress for a moment around a UIA experience, we just finished adjudicating the Architectural Innovation Award that the UIA Education Commission, with the support of Tom and the UIA Council, were able to launch for its inaugural cycle this year. And we intentionally extended the deadline of the award, which looks at pedagogical innovation broadly around the sustainability development goals. But we extended the deadline in order to allow schools to incorporate tactics and strategies that they had developed specifically in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we were very happy to see the results. They are now published and available, and UIA just sent out an announcement a few days ago of the winners. We had an illustrious jury from all over the world. It was very well regionally represented and very broad. But one of the things that stood out was this pan-regional social cultural dialogue. I think people in different parts of the world are no longer as insular and as isolated around their problems and challenges. And the pandemic has really accelerated that process. Some of the losses, however, are that we lost the core part of studio teaching, which is haptic pedagogies. Students are no longer working with their hands, working with manual modeling techniques. Instructors are no longer able to engage physically with sites and materialities. A lot of the lab work that students were able to engage hands-on in construction and in material experimentation is no longer happening. A lot of the costs that we saved in operational costs learning spaces are offset to individuals, which can be a problem and can create these increased inequalities and technological poverty. Not all places of the world and not all people in those places have the kind of sophisticated setup of internet and digital technology and software and devices that can maintain the kind of excellence that you need and speed and efficiency that you need to do this online. There's been an increased incidence, and I think Professor 𝙈𝘼𝙿𝘼 talked about that, of mental health challenges. Students are suffering, working alone, working under tremendous pressure to deliver in a setup that they are not acquainted with without the benefits of the social support that they get from their colleagues and friends on campus. We also have an increased possibility of exclusion and discriminatory practices around language ability and communication, students with certain vulnerabilities, whether they be language barriers, physical barriers, sensory barriers, visual impairment, and so on. These gaps are only being increased because of the format that we're being forced to use. One of the other losses that I've found that we found as a group, is the loss of this social connection and social capital that's created by the studio experience, and the loss of what I call the benefits of interstitiality, those events and learning opportunities and connecting opportunities that happen in between. So we all log on to these perfect little boxes of time where we go into a meeting, have these wonderful conversations, but the conversations that happen in the corridors and in or around meals and around social activities are not happening anymore. And that loses social capital, loses opportunities for creative connection and creative social development. So these are just a few of the pros and cons that at the Education Commission and through our network of colleagues around the world, we've started to identify. Next slide, please. We've also, as teachers and instructors, all of us started looking into what it means to, from a social spatial perspective, what it means to work at home, what it means to work within a studio environment. And this is a snapshot that is actually a good example of all the losses and gains I was talking about earlier. This is a snapshot from a class taught at Yale University School of Architecture in their MArch post-professional degree program that is run by a phenomenal architect by the name of Joel Sanders and his team. And Joel and I and a few others have recently put together a design think tank called Mixed Design, and it looks specifically at intersections across vulnerable communities. But one of the things that we as a think tank were concerned with were how the pandemic is shifting what we call body politics, and that point around exclusion and discrimination, not only in the online platform, but in the physical platforms where the students engage in learning of their home versus the studio. So this was a Zoom class that we conducted as part of Joel's body politics class. You'll see on the call 𝙈𝘼𝙂𝘿𝘼, who is the author of Deaf Space, who was looking at this from the deaf space perspective, myself and some others, 𝙈𝘼𝙂𝘼𝘿𝘼 Arroyo, who is a disabilities mobility expert. And we were looking at the students' mapping of their home learning space. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see a comparative analysis of the body politics and the body geometry and the body choreography. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. And the comparison of that with the body politics and the body choreography of that same student within a studio space. And with that kind of level of detailed mapping, you start to see the differences between working from home and working in a studio experience from the perspective of an individual user. And you can start mapping and identifying the gaps and the benefits and the gains. So this is just a quick snapshot of two things. An example of the kind of research and learning that we can take from comparing the online learning experience from the studio learning experience, and also an example of that kind of cross-cultural, cross-border learning that can happen in a class that's happening at Yale that brought in experts and teachers to co-teach this class and students from all over the world. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. At AUC, we've also been doing a careful examination of the future of our learning spaces. And just coincidentally, we were in the middle of this learning spaces task force when the pandemic happened. And one of the questions that we, of course, asked ourselves, what will the new normal be when we go back to our learning spaces on campus? And this was a more broad conversation around learning spaces in general, but many of the concepts that we came up with, we're working closely with a sub-consultant, Shirley Dugdale through Dugdale Strategy, who is an education consultant who helps support on this research project. But we quickly started identifying different scenarios. Pandemic threat recedes or if it persists, and if the global economy remains challenged and taxed or if it recovers. We identified the economy and the pandemic as the two major factors that higher education institutions are going to be struggling with as they leave the pandemic. And we started brainstorming different scenarios and agile ways that we could navigate and maneuver around designing our future learning spaces so that we could adapt and change and accommodate whichever one of those quadrants occurs. We all hope, of course, that we would land in the top right quadrant where the pandemic threat recedes and the global economy recovers. That's perhaps a little optimistic, but it's important to have these kinds of questions and these kinds of scenarios in mind so that we can move with flexibility and agility into our new normal. Next slide, please. And the consensus that we found out of that project of looking at the different scenarios across the different quadrants of possibilities was that it seems that whatever happens in the future, the hybrid high flex, so flexibility, hybridity, digitality will forever be part of our studio, partially for reasons that we hope won't happen, which is the persistence of the pandemic or other health concerns, but also because of the benefits that these types of systems use to bring in multiple players, to allow students to learn in different formats, to support learners that have different abilities, and so on and so forth. There's just an endless array of advantages that will come out of it. And then the final slide, please. Thank you. So at the UIA, UNESCO UIA Education Commission, along with many, and these are just a few of our partners that we are working on in the architectural education world, the Royal Institute of British Architects, who are our system operator for our validation system, the American Collegiate Schools of Architecture, who have long been our partners and with whom we've worked closely, co-hosted several events, and are in continuous dialogue with around the future of architectural education. The Architectural Association in Europe, the European Architectural Association, that looks at architectural education across Europe, and ArchAsia's own architectural education program are just a few of our partners who have been part of this dialogue. And all of us very recently, with the help and the support of our partners in the Sustainability Development Goals program, and some colleagues like Peter Oborn, and others who are spearheading the efforts towards integrating not only education but practice around sustainability development goals, have really urged us to think about this future and how the pandemic can make us rethink where architectural education can fall and align with our sustainability development goals. And hopefully we'll leave this pandemic with lessons learned and will carry forward more benefits than losses.